Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. This week, President Trump proclaimed on his social media account that museums all over the country are the last remaining vestiges of woke. He was troubled explicitly that, quotes, the Smithsonian is out of control, where everything discussed is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, close quotes. So, add to Trump's call for the return of the Confederate insignia and statues honoring Robert E. Lee, the censoring of museums referencing that slavery was bad. Yes, this is really happening. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We're here with Dr. Gerald Horne today discussing his new book, Capital Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. And as we were talking before we started taping, oh my goodness, you did a nice job with this book. And it is so timely with all the things going on with the Trump administration and the Smithsonian and problems we're having with American history being suppressed. So tell us about what brought you to this book. You've written many books about slavery and revolutions before. Tell us about this book.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, let me put this work in a historiographical context. It has not received sufficient attention, in my estimation, but there is fundamentally a schism in the historiography with regard to the early republic and the roots of the early republic. You see this in the book by perhaps the most garlanded Black historian of his generation, the late Tyler Stovall of UC Berkeley, his book, White Freedom. You see this in the work of the paramount Black intellectual, speaking of Ishmael Reed, now approaching 90, headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area, his spoof of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza by Lin-Manuel Miranda, speaking of Hamilton. You see this in the documentary by perhaps the leading Pan-African filmmaker of this generation, speaking of the former Minister of Culture of Haiti, Raoul Peck, Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism. A word interesting, or a term, interestingly enough, in progressive circles in the United States, more likely to be applied to historic Palestine than North America for whatever reason. You see this in the work of Howard University's Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project, which created a firestorm, including a rebuke from the White House, not to mention establishment historians, when she had the audacity to suggest that the revolt against British rule, spearheaded by slave owners like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, James Madison et al., might have had something to do with slavery. You see this in the work by the late Jamaican philosopher Charles Mills, The Racial Contract. You see this in Native American historiography in terms of Ned Blackhawk of Yale, his book, The Rediscovery of America. As a matter of fact, you may want to invite him on to this particular program.
Okay.
And so the sum and substance is that many of the Native Americans stress that a trigger for 1776 was land. That is to say, the proclamation line of 1762, 1763, where London expressed displeasure at continuing to move west, expending blood and treasure so that the settlers could profit. As a matter of fact, you might have noticed in the book at hand, my book, I stumbled across the will of George Washington. And undoubtedly, he was one of the leading landowners on planet Earth.
That was unreal. Yeah, I was surprised. I was surprised that you stumbled across that. All of the founding fathers have, problems with their motivations and their ownership of slaves, and that was well established.
So Ned Blackhawk stresses that as a trigger. And of course, many of the aforementioned Black historians, and I should say that they are all Black for whatever reason, stress the question of slavery, for example. Uh, some of it is embedded in the text at hand in the sense that I talk about how during the War of 1812, that when the Redcoats invaded Washington, and that in August 1814, many of the enslaved Africans joined them in torching the White House, sending James Madison, the president, and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing to the streets one step ahead of the posse. And from a theoretical point of view, the point I'd like to put forward is that increasingly, and you see this too reflected in the historiography, I would recommend this book too, by David McNally, Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History, that increasingly the enslaved population, in my articulation, is viewed as the unpaid sector of the working class. And by dint of their objective conditions, they were compelled to engage in class struggle. That is to say, being unpaid is no holiday. And it leads to malingering, it leads to resistance of all sorts, up to and including attacks on the state, which we saw in August 1814. Whereas the aforementioned settler colonialism oftentimes involves class collaboration. If you go back, as I did in my book on the 16th century, when England tried to establish its first settlement in what they called North Carolina, it was a project sponsored by the 1% in London with a heterogeneous mixture of Europeans crossing the Atlantic with the mutual goal of uprooting the indigenous, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, getting Africans dragged kicking and screaming across the Atlantic. And I think as well that this venture into history has obvious contemporary repercussions, because as we speak, we need an understanding on all fronts, not least theoretical, but also historical, of why it is that so many are talking about we're on the verge of fascism, particularly in light of this so-called experiment in Washington, D.C., where the residents are now being treated like guinea pigs, with that president about to be exported, we're told, to Chicago and elsewhere. And for those who take an opposing view, a view opposed to the historiography I just articulated, I think, as the lawyers might say, the burden of proof has shifted. They need to explain if the United States, the creation of which was such a great leap forward for humanity, where did it go off the rails? Where did we go from being a great leap forward for humanity to being on the verge of fascism? Was it during the reign of Andrew Jackson? I mean, we need an explanation. And if you
Well,
don't need an explanation, you need to go back to the drawing board.
here's one explanation that might help. I'm sure you're aware of this. I'll show you. The chart is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's the number of Confederate monuments and statues that were built from 1870 to 1890. As you can see, it was escalated during 1900 to 1920, during the lynchings and the Lost Cause and the KKK. Then it dropped, and then it also upticked again around Brown versus Board of Education. And you said in one of your previous podcasts, why are there not controversies about statues of Mussolini? We're still arguing about statues of Robert E. Lee and whether or not Trump wants to bring these statues back and so forth. So there's something in our history with this kind of unresolved issues with our slavery and our founding, and that's the foundation of your book. You talk about, rather than being the central of democracy, Washington D.C. is the hub of slavery. It is it's the hub of our racial violence, and of Black resistance. To that, they with a lot more opposition than I think I was aware of. I don't know. Chat about that. Did I get that relatively close?
Sure. And as the book suggests, you had enslaved Africans being sold in the shadow of the Capitol. That is
Right.
to say, you had the spectacle of these legislators prattling and prating about freedom and liberty in
Mhm.
the halls of Congress. And within a stone's throw, you had Africans being sold, not to mention being sold across the river in Alexandria, Virginia, which at one time, of course, was part of the District of Columbia. I should also mention that in terms of resistance, after the War of 1812 was settled, circa 1815, the early Republic elite decided that the free population, particularly of Baltimore, which had the largest, most substantial free black population in the early Republic, they were scapegoated. They were blamed for what the enslaved did in August 1814. It was also thought that the free Negroes set a bad example for the enslaved because they were a living and walking model that you could be black and not necessarily be enslaved. And so they came up with this idea by dint of the American Colonization Society of shipping the free Negroes across the Atlantic and establishing the state of Liberia, established approximately 200 years ago. And as I said, the Republican elite were in charge of the American Colonization Society. Then after the Nat Turner Revolt in neighboring Virginia in August 1831, the idea was to free a number of the enslaved and ship them across the Atlantic to Liberia. And I think that in terms of the contribution to the literature, which is what you're supposed to do, as opposed to just repeating what has already been said, Liberia has a very intriguing history. On the one hand, it understandably, the leaders have been excoriated for their conflicts with the indigenous, pre-existing indigenous population. It's particularly the Kru, K-R-U, in that part of Africa. But if you look at the Liberian Declaration of Independence in the 1840s, they they were furious with the United States of America. They were angry with the United States of America with good reason. And so, therefore, they tried to use global levers to put pressure on Washington. In the 1840s, as is the case today, Washington was festooned with foreign legations. And that is part of the missing link of the resistance in Washington today. That is to say, as we speak, uh, Venezuela is under the gun. A flotilla has been sent to the shores of the northern coast of South America. Secretary of State Rubio has sought to penalize countries that accept Cuban medics. And of course, the missing link is for those who are seeking to resist neo-fascism in Washington, and by implication nationally, should obviously be knocking on the door of the Cuban interest section, for example. So I could go on in this vein, but perhaps I should pass the mic.
Let's pass the mic to Greg. He always has good comments. What's your
Well,
thoughts, Greg?
yeah, I was struck. Professor Horne's comments reminded me very much of a book by Eric Hobsbawm, the celebration of the anniversary of the French Revolution. And he spoke about bourgeois revolutions, and he said, it's an interesting fact that countries around the world sought to emulate the French Revolution in terms of their flags and the colors on their flags and their notions. But they didn't quite put the U.S. Revolution in the same category. And he was puzzled, by that. He just let it go. He didn't go into it. But the French Revolution was celebratory. Everyone wanted to emulate it. It meant something. But I think that has something to do with the fact that it's tarnished. The American Revolution is a tarnished revolution, and it's a complex, very complex. And I think historiography kind of reflects the moment more than, like, for example, in the 30s, when Du Bois, people like Herbert Aptheker, was trying to bring down the way people thought about slavery. It reflected that moment. And so his history has to correct these things. And I think I go back to what you said about settler colonialism and how it hasn't really caught on so much with the left in this country as it does with Palestine. People are very, very receptive to say that's a settler colonial country, but they're a little bit reluctant because there's the celebratory aspect that we've all been trained with from our civics lessons and our American history courses. And So the corrective that's out there is a very important corrective, and it's necessary for the moment. So I appreciate that.
Well, I would add, of course, a few details. One, that despite protestations to the contrary, at the end of the 18th century, post 1776, there were thousands of enslaved Africans on the verge of the U.S. Civil War. There were millions.
Mhm.
And of course, many argue that the seeds of abolitionism were planted in 1776. I would hate to think,
Oh,
to conjure up a picture of a republic where the seeds of anti-abolition were planted with this exponential growth from the thousands to the millions, and that's anti-slavery, supposedly. I guess if it were pro-slavery, it would be from the thousands to the billions, like, which would be mathematically impossible. And I think as well that we need to think about post-1865, which I seek to do a bit in this text at hand. That is to say, with the abolition of slavery in what is now Haiti, and of course, Haiti is now a very important aspect of this renewed historiography, for example, because the Haitians abolished slavery, showing that it was possible. A footnote with regard to the French Revolution in the 1790s, post July 1789, with the attack on the Bastille, you had a temporary abolition of slavery in other French colonies, such as in the Americas. But with the rise of Napoleon, of course, there was an attempt to restore enslavement, including in Haiti. And this is where things get even more complicated because Napoleon sought to emancipate the Jewish population. And that's why it's difficult to make these assumptions, which I think are even made today. That is to say, because these so-called bourgeois revolutions, they might move in a progressive direction with regard to anti-Semitism. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to move in a progressive direction across the board, not to mention with regard to an investment in human property, for example, which brings me to the expropriation of the enslaved in Haiti, which leads to reparations paid to the French enslavers at gunpoint, which has crippled the Haitian economy ever since. When Britain abolished slavery in the 1830s, it led to compensation to the enslavers, which gave them a leg up in terms of a rising British capitalism bleeding into imperialism. Interestingly, slavery was abolished in the district in 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863. The enslavers were compensated, of course, not the enslaved. But post 1865, with the abolition of enslavement throughout Dixie, the enslavers were not compensated. And I suggest that that contributes to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, contributes to the rise of lynching, it contributes to the ferocity of white supremacy. And I think it also contributes to anti-communism because uh, when the socialist project, which of course was ongoing, but then takes a great leap forward in 1917, many thought that socialism meant the uncompensated expropriation of private property, which of course harkens back to what happens in Dixie post 1865. And I think that that helps to explain not only the ferocity of white supremacy, it helps to explain why some of the leading lights of the anti-communist movement happen to be of African descent, be it Paul Robeson, be it W.E.B. Du Bois, be it Ben Davis, William Patterson, Claudia Jones, et al. And so this is part of the history that I'm trying to recount in this text.
Uh, let me draw kind of an obtuse connection between this. In 1947, there was Eisenhower was having modern art at the Smithsonian, and people were freaking out because it was modern art. Here's a quote from George Dondero, Republican of Michigan. Modern art is communistic because it is distorted and ugly, because it does not glorify our beautiful country and smiling people and our material progress. Art that does not glorify our country in plain, simple terms breeds dissatisfaction. Here is a tweet from or a social media post from Donald Trump just a couple of days ago. Museums throughout Washington, but all over the country, are essentially the last remaining segments of woke. And then he says the Smithsonian is out of control and he wants to purge it of all references to slavery and, well, to slavery being so bad, I guess, is part of it. So you have the communist red threat back in the 40s going after the museums because of modern art. You've got Trump right now going after them because they're too woke. And this reminds me of an article that Greg wrote recently in ML Today about Gramsci, that culture is downstream of politics. They're trying to redefine what is important through their political distortion of what really occurred in the past. What do you think about that?
Oh, sure. And on an optimistic note, I think it's going to be difficult to uproot and extirpate all of the progressive trends that have been unleashed in recent decades. I mean, I think about this a lot because, as you may know, I've been interviewing scholars for a few years now. Every week, twice a week, scholars being interviewed on kpfk.org in Pacific Station in Los Angeles. And so they're seated throughout the academy, not only in the United States, but last week I interviewed a scholar in France who just wrote a book that's of relevance to our struggle. So it won't be impossible, but it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Trump and his minions to turn the tide. And that's at least what I would like to think.
I appreciate so much that you're bringing political economy back into, as a decisive factor in understanding these things, back into the picture. It's not just a cultural phenomenon at all, but it's based upon the profitability of slavery, for example, and how that shaped and reshaped. It's the point that Charles Beard made. And of course, that fell out of favor among historians at a certain point. It just sort of fell out of favor. It's like, oh, that was all wrong. But of course, it wasn't all wrong. It had to do with the fact that there is a material base for our revolution. And when you examine it, it's polluted. It's polluted with the wealth and with the racism, with and the benefits that slavery would bring in the minds of these wealthy people to this country. It's interesting to me, maybe you could comment on that, how the transition to the cotton economy became such a major factor, not only in the United States, but globally, which in turn made it essential to the economy, the political economy of the US, and shaped the way our political world was developed at that time.
Well, it ties in to the reality that has been well known for some time, that on the verge of the US Civil War, the most important investment in the Republic was that in the bodies of enslaved Africans, which gives you an idea of the ferocity of the reaction when the investor class had their property nullified and negated without compensation. I think as well that it also gives an idea of the fierce resistance. For example, the book at hand starts with the attack on Harper's Ferry in what was then Virginia, now Virginia, October 1859, spearheaded by the late, great John Brown, joined by his comrades. Osborne Anderson, one of the Negroes in his band, had gotten the drop on Washington, a lateral descendant of the founder of the Republic, who started crying like a baby because he thought that he was about to meet his maker. I should also mention another relevant fact, which is that the John Brown plot was basically devised in Canada, in Southern Ontario, which of course not only ties into the War of 1812 aforementioned and the attempt to seize Canada, And then we go back a few decades, and as many of our scholars who apparently lack curiosity as to why it was that only 13 colonies revolted, the New York Times had a piece just a day or two ago that talked about Quebec City and said that 2% of the population in Quebec City speak English. There's a lot of dissatisfaction historically in Quebec. One of the reasons why there was a lot of anti-London sentiment. As a matter of fact, after living in Canada for most of 2025, I walked away with the nostrum, once repeated, not so much today, that workers speak French, bosses speak English. So you need to ask, well, why didn't Quebec revolt, for example? And of course, to answer that question, you then have to do an X-ray of the Protestant sect, or at least what was once called a sect, and the anti-Catholicism, which was once a signal aspect of the history of North America. In fact, it's going to figure heavily in the book that I am researching, which I worked on in Canada, Comparative Settler Colonialism. That is to say, British Columbia versus what is now Washington State and Oregon. Because interestingly enough, when the indigenous in those two territories revolted in the 1840s and the 1850s, amongst those scapegoated were not only the Hudson Bay Company, chartered in 1670, going bankrupt in 2025, interestingly bought by a Chinese billionaire. And of course, Canadian colonialism was heavily extractive colonialism. Furs, timber, for example, which then led to various sorts of alliances with the indigenous population, which is one of the reasons why their survival rate has been more significant than the settler colonialism on this side of the border, which presupposed virtually the liquidation of the indigenous population. And it also feeds into other aspects of the law that I'm afraid to say have not been sufficiently explored. For example, this phenomenon in the United States of anti-miscegenation laws. In the 1850s, in Washington Territory, Governor Stevens declared martial law and sought to detain many of his fellow leaders who were married to Native American women because they were thought to be a security risk because they would leak plans to Native American men. Whereas in Canada, you of course have the Métis, M-E-T-I-S, which is a mixture of oftentimes the French and the indigenous. Now, when I talk about this in Canada, they don't necessarily like it because they think I'm letting Canada off the hook, which I understand. But at the same time, we need an understanding of not only why we're moving towards neo-fascism south of the border, but also why the Tangerine Tyrant has talked about annexing Canada, making the 51st state, which I think is going to have enormous consequences for U.S. foreign policy that have not been contemplated as of yet, because Canada is scrambling right now to effectuate alliances with countries near and far. I'll just leave it at that.
I have a question. Again, you are a stimulus. I mean, you really stimulate thinking, and I know you have argued that our revolution, the U.S. revolution, was really part of what motivated it was the fact that the British were moving in a direction towards abolishing slavery or abolishing slavery. And then we look at the fact that that country also was one of the founders of colonial suppression in India and other places, Egypt, all around the world. They were no good guys, even though they may have been moving in that direction. What's difficult for me to understand is, at the time of the Civil War, how is it they didn't join with the South? I mean, what is the decisive factor that kept them? They had every interest. I mean, the cotton industry was critical for what they were doing. They had to shift their acquisition of cotton back to India, to Egypt, and other places. And yet they held out. I mean, it was, I think, touch and go, but what was it about this empire, which was never kind to any of its subjugated people, that kept them from siding once again with the bad guys?
Well, it's interesting. As you know, in 2025, there are many, many who I respect, who suggest that in high stakes elections, we cast our ballot for the Democratic Party, even though it's fair to say that at the top, it's a party that spearheaded the war in Vietnam, spearheaded the war in Korea under Truman, the escapade in Ukraine under Biden, et cetera. Because oftentimes history does not necessarily present neat proposals and solutions. And the fact of the matter is that Britain, as my former colleague Richard Blackett suggested, as was once said by some far-sighted folks in Europe pre-1989, they said that they liked Germany so much that they wanted two of them, East and West Germany. And so there were those in London who said, well, we would like to see two republics in North America. And of course, that would blunt the rise of this rising competitor. But having said that, there was not diplomatic recognition extended formally to the so-called Confederate States of America, which then allows me to introduce a separate point, which I'll be expanding upon in my comparative settler colonial book, which is that Russia sent fleets to the Atlantic and the Pacific coast to bolster the Lincoln government. Russia, as we now know, sold its claims to Washington, its claims to Alaska to Washington, 1867, in part to thwart London, and in part to keep London from seizing Alaska so that it could then have a pincers movement against British Columbia from Washington in the south and Alaska to the north. And one of my criticisms that I've been making of the Douglas leadership, the leadership spearheaded by Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, is that even though Douglass, as he should have, spent as much time in London pre-1861, rallying abolitionists who, it turns out, played a pivotal role in keeping Her Majesty from extending diplomatic recognition to the Confederates, I don't think the Douglas leadership paid sufficient attention to Russia, for example, and other parts of the world. Now, this was corrected, of course, by the Du Bois leadership, the Robeson leadership of the 20th century. But with their demise, of course, we still have a gaping hole in terms of our political approaches, because history has shown that given the correlation of forces domestically, in order to overcome enslavement, it involved global alliances with British abolitionists, Haitian revolutionaries. In this book, I talk about, of course, the progressive sentiments in Liberia, progressive sentiments in France, for example. Just like with regard to the retreat of Jim Crow in the 20th century, it involved the rise of a socialist camp putting pressure on U.S. imperialism, which was seeking hearts and minds in Africa and the Caribbean and elsewhere, and found it difficult as long as Jim Crow stained their escutcheon. And as I said, that's the missing link today. And of course, it has a lot to do with the fact that many of our liberal, quote, friends, unquote, went all in with regard to the Red Scare. And now, of course, they're scrambling because the New York Times reported that the ultimate goal of Mr. Trump with this impaneling a grand jury in South Florida to investigate the so-called Russiagate scandal is to jail Barack Obama, for example.
Oh God, that'd be better than Bolton. Yeah.
Well, let me make another point, and I think it's been a classic. In other words, the liberals collaborated with the right wing in terms of squashing or attempting to squash those to their left in the 1950s. And now that those to their left have been sufficiently weakened, the right wing are now coming after the liberals. I mean, it was utterly predictable. And it's a shame and a sin that it's not better recognized.
Yeah, we had that fellow Blue Collar on that was talking about the in Central and South America, how it was the labor unions that were using to suppress,
you put the spotlight on Washington, D.C., and I think that's important. And now the spotlight's on Washington, D.C. again. And some people are suggesting, and I think there's merit to this, that Trump is going after D.C. because in many ways it was a black city. And then I'm reading Black Agenda Report, Margaret Kimberly, Counterpunch. I didn't realize how deeply, profoundly Washington, D.C. has been gentrified. I think in 1970, the population was over 70% African American. Today, it's down to a little over 40%, which is another process that's been occurring to take this city away and take the city in a different direction. And so it isn't really the city it was in the past. So why is Trump? Why did he pick D.C.? And in keeping with your book, why was the spotlight on D.C. as opposed to maybe Chicago or another city?
Well, Washington, D.C. is a soft target if you want to have a neo-fascist experiment. Unlike Illinois, where Governor Pritzker has suggested that the National Guard being deployed in that town is something that's utterly undesirable. And of course, he has presidential aspirations. Unlike Los Angeles and California, where Governor Newsom has stood up against the deployment of National Guard in the City of the Angels. And of course, he has presidential aspirations as well. You are correct to suggest that, coincidentally enough, many of the cities that have been targeted, Baltimore with a black mayor and of course a black governor, Wes Moore, who too has presidential aspirations, Chicago with Mayor Johnson, Los Angeles with Mayor Bass, Oakland with Barbara Lee. Now, of course, Mr. Trump or many of his defenders would say, well, he just issued a broadside against San Francisco, which does not have a black mayor. So what are you doing? Playing the race card from the bottom of the deck.
Yeah.
But I think that Washington, D.C., it does not have a governor. It does not have senators. The sole congressional representative has circumscribed voting rights, speaking of the enfeebled 80-plus Congresswoman Holmes Norton. Washington, D.C. is one of the most heavily surveilled cities on planet Earth. There are 17 intelligence agencies headquartered there, not to mention all manner of police in addition to the Metropolitan Police Department. There's park police and other forms of police. The FBI under Kash Patel has been sent into the streets to walk the beat. They're headquartered in Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is a soft target. And of course, gentrification is another arrow in the quiver of those who would like to transform the capital city, which, as I try to point out, having this substantial black population is a direct legacy of slavery, a direct legacy of Jim Crow, a direct legacy of the fact that the unpaid sector of the working class helped to build the White House itself. And also, I should say, were in pivotal and instrumental positions when there were invaders, like the Redcoats in the War of 1812. So fast forwarding to today, I think I might have mentioned it. If not, let me mention it again because it bears repeating, that when Attorney General Pam Bondi, or Scam Blondie, as she's sometimes known as, wanted to impanel a grand jury to investigate the Russiagate so-called scandal. It was impaneled in South Florida because grand jurors who were black are not necessarily seen as being politically reliable. I go into that in some detail in my previous book on Washington, Revolting Capital, Racism, Radicalism in Washington, D.C. Part of the contradiction of the post-Jim Crow trajectory was this reality of black jurors trying the miscreants coming out of the White House, coming out of Congress, et cetera. And that has led to a movement to move federal agencies outside of the district, either to Virginia or Maryland, as has been debated about the FBI, or to Colorado, to Huntsville, Alabama, for example, in order to do an end run around what used to be called Chocolate City.
You know, one thing in your book, you talk about DC being the hub of slavery and lot of violence, but you also talk about it being a great point of resistance,
Oh yeah.
and that was, I think, really important with the War of 1812 and Nat Turner. And even though this resistance might not have been as effective, they were real, and it created this overreaction and fear. Just as your book on Haiti, I remember reading that. That little event in Haiti had waves and waves of influence on politics. To this day, it still has influence on politics. Talk about that, about how, as the picture from behind me, for those who are watching, I have a slave revolt behind my green screen here. Tell me about the importance of the resistance and how powerful that was in shaping what our politics.
Well, a concept that I try to expand upon is this concept of the enslaved proletariat, for example. The late historian Robert Starobin, and of course you may recognize that surname, uh, he wrote an entire book on industrial slavery. And I think it's fair to say that from a materialist point of view, there is good reason for the enslaved industrial proletariat to have developed a certain kind of consciousness leading to a certain kind of resistance. In fact, I mentioned the new book by Dave McNally, who I suggested that you bring onto your program. He suggests that there was a similar sort of consciousness even amongst plantation enslaved. Now, plantation enslaved and industrial slave were on the border across the river in Virginia. Washington, D.C. mostly had an unpaid sector of the working class involved in services, for example, or involved in being butlers in the White House, which, of course, you still have that to a certain degree. Although I haven't seen any newspaper stories of Mr. Trump trying to purge the black butlers from the White House, but it would not surprise me if that were taking place. And what's interesting about Washington is that you not only had the aforementioned August 1814 the Nat Turner uprising, the John Brown episode, but then you had in the 1840s these mass attempts at flight, which can, when you see that in Du Bois's book Black Reconstruction, he puts that in the context of a kind of general strike when you have workers fleeing their posts in mass. And you had quite a bit of that as well in the District of Columbia. And I think it's fair to say as well that that kind of consciousness of resistance helps to explain why it is that you still have in the Black community a demographic that votes most heavily against the right wing. Now, of course, there have been many stories about defections to the Republicans, but if the population or the electorate as a whole voted like the Black population, that is to say, at least 7-3, sometimes 8-2, sometimes 9-1 amongst Black women, Mr. Trump would be in an orange jumpsuit as opposed to carousing in the streets of Washington and elsewhere.
Mhm. Let's do a little compare and contrast between the issue of the immigration, the black oppression that you're talking about with slavery, but now we have this, if you would substitute in our immigration demonization. You got the Fugitive Slave Act, and you've got the ICE raids.
Mm.
You have, these slaves are viewed as, lazy, and the immigrants are viewed as taking our jobs. It just is a new demon, a new problem that we have to use as an excuse to control the population, control our politics. Is that too far a stretch, or is there a lot of
No, not at
direct
all.
parallels?
I mean, I think of separation of families, for example. that
Yes.
is an emblem of the Trump immigration policy. And there's a scene from Roots. You might recall Roots, the
Hmm.
multi-part docudrama from the 1970s based on the book by Alex Haley. You can probably find on YouTube the scene of the splitting up of a Black family, for example. It's quite heartrending, even though it's drama and it's meant to pluck the heartstrings. But certainly you can draw a parallel between taking babies from the bosoms of their mothers in the 19th century and in the 21st century. And likewise, I think that with regard to deportation or self-deportation, uh, self-deportation of the free Negro population was encouraged in the 19th century. Self-deportation of the undocumented sector of the working class is encouraged. But it's more than that. In my book on the 16th century, I point out the parallels between the persecution visited upon the Jewish minority in Europe and how some of those forms of persecution were then exported across the Atlantic and applied to the indigenous and the African population. And at the same time, when historians have tried to tell us that a la the aforementioned Napoleon, there was a kind of emancipation of the Jewish population once they crossed the Atlantic, I point out episodes to the contrary, although, of course, we do know that the so-called brains of the Confederacy, Judah P. Benjamin, happened to be of Jewish background. But in any case, with regard to this connection between anti-Jewish fervor and anti-Black racism, there were suggestions with regard to the former in Europe that they had a certain kind of odor, for example, oftentimes applied to the Black population, that they had tails. In fact, in the military in World War II, when you had some of the first intimate encounters between Black and non-Black populations, the stories are rife with regard to non-Black soldiers looking behind the Negroes to see where the tail is. You know, so what we should take away from these parallels is the necessity for unity, the necessity for anti-bigotry, and to the point, I think, of your question, the necessity to rise to the defense of the undocumented sector of the working class. Speaking of a population of heavily Mexican ancestry, but not exclusively Mexican ancestry, many of whom already have been deported to South Sudan after a stay in Djibouti in East Africa, many of whom are on the way to being sent to Uganda, believe
Uganda.
it or not. Of course, the number of beds for detainees is expanding exponentially as we speak, fattening the bottom line. Of course, Civic and other essential members of the U.S. prison industrial complex. We know that Mr. Trump has spoken derisively of what he calls the homegrowns. That's people like myself, since I was born here, presumably yourselves as well, who he thinks should be next in terms of being sent to prisons in El Salvador. So even if you do not have a humanitarian impulse, you may have an impulse towards self-preservation that causes you to leap to the defense of the undocumented sector of the working class.
I think it's so important. I think your emphasis on viewing slaves as a part of the working class, as a major part of the working class in the era of slavery, and viewing that as unpaid workers. They're unpaid workers. I think that's important for the working class to understand. I think that's an important contribution to our moving forward in terms of uniting people in the working class. And I'm sure you agree that racism and anti-communism have been the major factors in disuniting and breaking up any unity in the working class. What prospects do you see for our overcoming as a nation, overcoming those barriers to the unity that we need to go forward to really transcend this stage we're in today, this era we're in contemporarily? What are the prospects and how will that be done?
Well, just first of all, a couple footnotes. I wrote a book on John Howard Lawson, the late Hollywood communist screenwriter who did a lot of history writing. I recommend highly his book, The Hidden Heritage.
Yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, he points out in that book that part of the intensity that attaches to anti-Blackness comes from this of being property and then expropriated property without compensation, which is something that I've stressed. On the other hand, in the book I published last year on Los Angeles, I think we talked about this on this program. I pointed out the criticism of some of our scientists of society who oftentimes spoke of the working class and the Negro people, as if the Negro people overwhelmingly were not part of the working class. And I think that even though it may sound simplistic, I think that becomes a launching pad for certain kinds of misguided analyses. With regard to today, despite what I've said to this point, I remain optimistic. I think that what we need, of course, is what we've needed for a while, which is mass organizing drives by our unions, for example, which is obviously going to be difficult today, but it was difficult in the 1930s. I mean, for example, that obviously is a priority. And certainly what I've already made reference to is a resuscitation and a revival of internationalism. That is to say, the way we've been able to countervail an often negative correlation of forces and balance of forces domestically is by lengthening the battlefield, for example, which in turn, I should say, has been done to a certain degree. I mean, for example, you're probably familiar with the killing of Black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, about a decade or so ago. His parents and their attorneys mounted a case at the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, for example. I've mentioned more than once when I've had a microphone before me that our friends in Washington, D.C. are cheek by jowl with the Organization of American States, for example. In a few weeks, you'll have an important international gathering in Ethiopia, a face-to-face meeting between leaders of the African Union and leaders of the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago. There'll be a delegation, sizable, from Black America. And I dare say that on the sidelines of this important face-to-face meeting, that there will be an opportunity to buttonhole our friends who are there from Cuba, from Russia, from China, et cetera. That's going to unfold in a few weeks. And I'm going to be very interested to see if the corporate media covers that, because I think it's potentially quite transformative, this sort of internationalism. And of course, one of the reasons why the African Union headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and the Caribbean community are having this first face-to-face meeting is because of reparations. That is to say, put it another way, redistributing the wealth from the global north to the global south, so to speak, not least because of the uncompensated labor of enslaved Africans, not least in the Americas, and denuding Africa simultaneously. So those sorts of trends I find very hopeful.
Well, I just hope the cruelty stops, but I'm with Stephen Miller and as our president. I don't know if that's going to stop anytime soon. tell me what's next. You're going to do something about Washington State. Is it true that people were pretty mean to indigenous people in Washington State? Is that a theme of your new book?
Well, it is in part,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the Cayuse, Cayuse, the
Mm-hmm.
Walla Walla. Of course, there's a city
Right.
in the state of Washington that carries their name. As noted, liquidationism was the trend of settler colonialism south of the border, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be exploring that in length. But actually, next on the agenda, that'll be published in early 2026, is the counter-revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup, and the roots of U.S.
Oh.
imperialism in the
Oh.
Asia-Pacific basin.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
That
Interesting.
is to say, Hawaii was a sophisticated regime. It had diplomatic legations all over the world. And the so-called Republicans. And interestingly enough, these people in the United States, they have so many unkind words to say about socialism. Okay, fair enough. But what about republicanism? I mean, the cudgel used to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy was republicanism. And of course, it was racially coded republicanism. That is to say, there were the Hollies, as they were called in indigenous
Right.
Hawaiian language. The Euro-Americans were in the forefront of overthrowing the regime and setting up apartheid state. Their mistake was, of course, that they also tried to impose apartheid on the Asians, particularly rising Japan and their nationals that were in the archipelago. That didn't work out very well, as December 7th, 1941 tended to suggest. So this book will also deal a lot with China. And I'm working on a book on U.S.-China relations as we speak, because somebody's going to have to explain how and why it is we may be entering a China-centric century.
Right.
After all of this hullabaloo about the sole remaining superpower and blah, blah, blah. And that'll take a few more years. But the Hawaii book is ready to be served to an audience.
I have Hawaiian sisters live on one side of me and the other side of me. I just love them dearly. And if you just want to get them riled up, just talk about all the tech billionaires coming in and
Oh,
buying up the land in Hawaii. I mean, that it reminds me of the T-shirt that I just have. If you just eat one billionaire, the rest will fall in line. They would just love to, it's just horrible how they're coming in and screwing things up. It's just, but there you go. That's
Well,
that's
they
that's
own
the way.
everything, so they can do what they like. It's property.
Oh,
yeah, Larry
God.
Ellison, Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Uh,
it's such a
Andreessen, the libertarians are the worst. I mean, Musk and Andreessen and that crowd.
okay. Well, hey, this has been fun. I strongly recommend people pick up your book. I consider myself a historian and very knowledgeable, and I just every time I read your books, I just realize I don't know squat, and I learn a lot from you, and that's a very reinforcing thing for me. So I hope other people will do that too. And my goodness, thanks for spending time with us. It's just always wonderful to chat with you.
It's a
Thank you
great
for inviting
pleasure.
me.
Great
All
pleasure.
right. Bye now.
Thanks.